All right, so I want to welcome y'all to African American Studies or Black Studies with me, the Forecast. This is the first semester of the first course, Introduction into Black American Studies. And before we get started, let me give my disclaimer now. I don't have a degree. I haven't taken an official college course, but I have studied this particular topic for over a decade. And for the last 7 or 8 years, I have been going through history year by year, step by step, trying to retrace and study each event, each law, everything that happened from a black perspective. Now, I will say I have taken a few college courses online. And even though there's a lot of important information in those classes, I still think that is important and valuable information that usually gets skipped over. And I know sometimes universities and different colleges and certain professors have a strict curriculum that they have to follow and they can't get off that curriculum. But one critique that I do have for some African American studies professors, I don't agree with teaching history through certain ideologies or through the lens of certain people as opposed to just looking at the raw data, And then in the second semester, as we move along, we can come back to a lot of these important topics and really look at them in the ideologies that was created. But I think teaching ideology-based curriculums could possibly lead to ulterior motives and agendas or a certain biased perspective on history, as opposed to just looking at the data and the history itself. So for this course, we're just going to be looking at the information, just the history, and try to leave any biasness or ideology out of it, which I think will help the younger generation come up with newer, fresher ideas on top of the old ideas that we already have. All right. So that was one of my motivations to creating this course and ultimately, hopefully, a better curriculum, because we always want to update our information and what we're doing. And there are several reasons why I wanted to create this course. Number one, not all of us may not have access to a college level course, but it's important that we have this information. So I wanted to put something out there for those of us who are interested in the subject, but may not be able to take a college level course. Number two, I'm not limited by a curriculum to stay on certain topics or not address certain issues. We're not restricted to some curriculum so we can explore all of history and talk about who did what. And we won't be afraid to say any names. And also, one of the things I think is the most important is our education, because no matter what we build, no matter what we do, if we don't have the right mindset, we're only feeding it to the beast, to the system designed to destroy us. So if we don't approach things from the right mindset, then anything we'll do will be moot anyway. So I think education is extremely important, because if you don't know your history, you're doomed to make the same mistakes over and over. So again, welcome to African American Black Studies, Black American Studies. And I may use Black Americans or Black people in America, which is what I prefer, and African American interchangeably, right? Because I prefer Black people in America, but, So let's walk through this step by step and see how we got in the situation that we're in today and figure out how to get out of it. Now, for whatever critiques that I may have of Black studies professors, one thing that they say that I agree with is that it's important for our people to know that our history did not start in slavery.
If you show the African contribution to the history of the world, including Egypt, Ethiopia, Kush, and the biblical lands that you meet, That's a contradiction. You cannot say an inferior people created this. You cannot say an inferior people created the pyramids. You cannot say an inferior people created the Niger Valley civilization. You cannot say an inferior people brought into being independent states one after the other for over 1,000 years before the slave trade.
And yes, it is very important to know that because we've done so many great things throughout countless millennia, like the ancient Nubians in the kingdom of Kush, ancient Ethiopia, all the way up to the Songhai Empire, the Kingdom of Congo, the Mali Empire. Now, all of this history is extremely important as well. And I think it's so important that it should be its own course. So if you know anybody with a great African history or Black history course, or if you want to come up and teach one, I encourage you to do the same. We can link up and put these courses together, because it is extremely important to know these things. And another point in history that we won't touch on as much, but I think is extremely important, so important that it needs its own course as well, was the Arab slave trade, otherwise known as the trans-Saharan slave trade. I think that information is extremely important to know as well, and maybe we'll address it in a future course. Or if you know any courses like with Black history, African history, predating this time period that we're going to talk about, I think all of these are important to create courses for, especially for those of us who may not be able to go to a college course, or for young people to be able to learn and understand their history at a younger age. But in this course, we're dealing with a specific time period and a specific topic, which is Black American history, right, from a certain time period. And by the way, speaking on Mali, I'm sure a lot of us have heard of Mansa Musa, who was known as the richest man to ever live. And of course, there's another part to the story about him spreading Islam, but like I said, we'll touch on that in another course. But speaking about Africans in the land that we now know as the Americas, Mansa Musa's predecessor, Abu Bakr II, tried to cross the Atlantic in the 14th century or the 1300s. Now, a lot of people debate whether he made it or not, but one of the strongest pieces of evidence that he made it came from Columbus's journal. According to the book Africa and the Discovery of America by Leo Weiner of Howard University, he said Columbus talked to the Native Americans who confirmed that black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats trading in gold-tipped spears, which would be an accurate description if they had made it. And of course, it's still being debated. So my question for you is, do you think Abu Bakr II made it to the Americas, what we call the Americas today, before the Europeans? And it's also debated if other Africans made it to the Americas before Europeans. So my question to you all is, do you think any Africans were here before the Europeans showed up? And I have my opinions about whether Africans have made it before them or not, but I want to hear what you guys have to say. So, leave me a response about whether you think they made it or not. And by the way, there will be a time for any questions. If you have any questions, just go ahead and ask. Just put it in there. But after each session, I will give everybody an opportunity to ask questions. Now, even though we're talking about Black American history, for me, the history starts well before there was even an idea for an America. And I like to go all the way back to the beginning of the process, which for me is around the 1430s, when the Portuguese first started sailing around the west coast of Africa. Now, the reason why they had to go around the west coast of Africa is because the Muslims controlled everything to the east. So they couldn't just necessarily go right through the Muslims at the time. So they had to find another way around, which was to the west instead of to the east. Something I find kind of ironic and that's kind of funny. Because we make jokes about unseasoned food, how they don't season their food. But when you start putting the history together, and you'll see, right, unseasoned food goes together with colonization. And we'll get to 1492. But it's ironic because not only could they not go east, but they also lost access to spices. And if you look up the whole history of unseasoned food and European, all this stuff lines up. But it's just interesting that unseasoned food lines up with colonization. But anyway, as the Portuguese made their way around the west coast of Africa in the 1430s, there are some reports of the first kidnapped Africans in 1438. Some say 1441. Now, for me, this is where I started to clock on the transatlantic slave trade, for me personally. And you see here, even though it says they encountered and either purchased or captured a small number of Africans, likely kidnapped them, the first shipload of 235 African slaves landed in Portugal in 1444. And it is very likely that they were captured from the area around modern-day Senegal. Now, for me, this time is important, and I start the clock here. And I think that this time is very, very important for how everything ended up playing out. And the Portuguese started to become so effective in their kidnapping methods. The Pope, Nicholas V, and at this time, the Pope was very powerful in Portugal. The Pope, Nicholas V, issued a papal bull, or a special decree, or a special order known as the Dum Diversas. Now, the Dum Diversa was a very important document, probably the first to give Portugal the permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate what they call, quote-unquote, non-believers, and also enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms. So pretty much he was saying, if they don't follow your religion, you are free to conquer them, kill them, rape them, do whatever you want, take their land, and subjugate them. Now, this document changed the game. And although religion had been the major issue for some time, this gave birth, or at least laid the seeds for modern day racism and the race-based concept of looking at things. But their goal was to reduce non-Christians into perpetual servitude. And the term perpetual means forever, meaning you're still supposed to be their slaves. And then after they reached the Cape Verde Islands in 1455, the Pope, Nicholas V, doubled down on his papal bull and issued the Romanos Pontifex. And this essentially gave the Portuguese a monopoly for trade in the new areas around Africa. And these first two papal bulls only really applied to the Portuguese. Now, in 1493, another pope, Alexander VI, issued another papal bull, which was called Intercatera. And forgive me for how I'm pronouncing these things. That was colonized by the English and not the Spanish. Okay, so now this papal bull or decree authorized Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas, to enslave the Africans, and pretty much take everybody's land and resources. The only difference is now it wasn't just Portugal, it was Spain and Portugal. But the papal bull did make it clear that one Christian nation could not attack, invade, or enslave another Christian nation. In other words, if Portugal had already conquered a nation, Spain couldn't go in, and vice versa. And these three documents all put together became known as the doctrine of discovery. And essentially, it started the race to conquer land and people. And still to this day, at the time of me recording this, a few months ago, there was just protests still calling for the Pope to rescind the doctrine of discovery, which is technically still on the books.
In a Catholic shrine revered as a place of healing, centuries of wrongs quickly came into sharp focus. Catching the Pope's eye at the start of Holy Mass, a banner demanding Francis rescind the doctrine of discovery. In other words, quash the 15th century papal decrees that spurred colonization.
So by the time Christopher Columbus gets onto the scene, the roots for the slave trade had already been established. Now, I know most of us have heard about what has happened in 1492. And let me ask you, what is the first thing that comes to your head when you think of 1492? Now, 1492 was a very interesting year and several things happened. And as we know, that was the year the Moors got expelled from Spain, or at least they issued the decree. And by they, I mean Ferdinand and Isabella. And of course, we already know they felt threatened by the Moors. And they said they had to either convert to Christianity or leave. But they really didn't trust newly converts, so most of them had to leave anyway. Now, in 1492, the Sephardic Jews was also kicked out of Spain. And this is something that I want you to remember, right? Because in future lessons, we're going to keep an eye on where the Jews went and some of the things that they have done and their overall involvement in the slave trade and enslaving black people in America. So it's very important to keep an eye on them and what they're doing. And when many of the Jewish people were kicked out of Spain, a lot of them fled to North Africa, to Italy, and to places throughout Europe. And one of the places that many of them went to was the Netherlands and Amsterdam, which we know that they are considered the Dutch. Because throughout the 1400s, they got kicked out of several places, right, throughout the area. And they went to many different places, but some of the things that they have done it under the guise of the Dutch or another place. You know what I'm saying? That's why it's very important to keep an eye on that as well. And of course, not all of them left. Some of them converted. And many people believe Christopher Columbus was a Jew who converted. And there are some Jewish, quote unquote, scholars who talk about that, but, we're not even going to get into that. But earlier, I asked people what do they think of when they think of 1492. And thanks to our European education, a lot of people think about Christopher Columbus discovering America. And see, what's important here is that no matter who claims Christopher Columbus, whether it be the Italians or whatever, they're not going to down their ancestors, even if they know is a lie. They know he never set foot in North America or even laid eyes on America. But they're going to fight tooth and nail to keep Columbus Day as a holiday, even if they know it's a lie, which is very important when we do get to the point where we look at some of our black leaders and their ideologies. Or when we look at some of the things as we go through this particular course and we start to see names that we recognize. Of course, we know Christopher Columbus never set foot in North America. And even though he wasn't in India, he still called the people Indians anyway. But one thing they often leave out of the story was the black people that was with Columbus. And we know of the Nino brothers who were African sailors on the crew who landed in the Caribbean with Christopher Columbus. But we know they're going to leave us out of the history. Now, once Columbus saw the gold and all of the resources, right, the greed immediately took over. And when he saw how welcoming and friendly the people were, they invited him to the cookout. And the first thing that popped into his mind after seeing how kind they were was, we can easily kidnap some of these people and bring them back to show how easy it is to enslave them and take their land. And that's exactly what he did. He kidnapped some of them, took them back so that he could get more troops and they could take the land. So when they returned to Hispaniola, they kidnapped and shipped several hundred people back to Spain from Hispaniola. But countless others were forced to mine for gold. Everyone he came across, he attempted to enslave them and force them to mine for gold and other resources. And if anybody resisted, he cut off their hands, cut off their ears, cut out their tongue, or just beheaded them in front of everybody to send a message. And even though he called them savages, they were literally savagely raping women and young girls, and in some cases, young boys. And if anyone resisted, they were beaten into submission. And usually they brought in these attack dogs when anybody tried to resist or something like that, or to hunt down anybody who tried to run away. But they would take babies out of mothers' arms and literally feed them to their attack dogs. They became so savage, even other people on Columbus's crew became disgusted and said he was taking it way too far. Even people who was doing dirt themselves, they were appalled by everything that Columbus was doing. And when word got back, the population were act like they were disgusted, right? And Columbus was stripped of his title as governor. They took all of his money from him. They arrested him and shipped him back to put him on trial. And most of the public was outraged. And I know they like to say, well, it was a different time. But this is what I'm trying to show you. It wasn't, right? His actions were so savage, they put him on trial for it. And for his defense, right? Because when he first took them back to say we can conquer their land, he was saying how peaceful and docile they were. But for his defense during his trial, he said they were evil, they were savages, they eat men and drank the victim's blood. Now, this is clear projection. And we know that this projection still goes on today.
Should we think of Columbus as a hero or a villain? Let's review the evidence.
First charge, he enslaved the Indians.
Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor.
Verdict, guilty. Here he is showing off some Indian slaves to the king and queen.
In the name of the Holy Trinity, we consent from here all slaves which could be sold. One Indian is worth 3 Negros. Although they die now, they will not always die. Christopher Columbus, in a letter to Ferdinand and Isabella.
Second charge, he exploited the Indians.
Verdict, guilty. He demanded that the natives on the island of Hispaniola, where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are today, grow crops, tend to livestock, and most importantly, mine gold.
They had to bring that to a Spanish port, and then they got some kind of identification tag hung around their necks that they had done there. They had paid their tithe, and now they had to go back to these fields and find some more gold. And the Indians who were caught without this tag around their necks had their hands cut off.
Third charge, cruelty.
Verdict, guilty. He condoned the raping of Indian girls as young as age 10 and let their parents die without so much as a word of remorse.
Fourth charge, murder.
Verdict, guilty. As one historian says, Columbus was responsible for thousands of Indians dying from murder, mutilation, and suicide. When Columbus arrived in Hispaniola, by one estimate, there were about 250,000 Arawak Indians. There may have been even many more. Within 2 years, half had died. By 1550, just 50,000 were left. By 1650, there were none.
But even though there was outrage and the outcry about the crimes that Columbus was committing, the King Ferdinand loved him so much that he freed him, he restored his wealth, gave him everything back, and told him that he would fund one more voyage, quote-unquote voyage, for him, especially after the Pope Alexander VI issued his papal bull in 1493. And incidentally, the illegitimate son of Alexander VI was Caesar Borgia, who a lot of you have heard people say that painting of the white Jesus may have been him. The painting that we see in so many black homes and in black churches. A lot of people believe that may have been Caesar Borgia, the illegitimate son of Alexander VI. But, it's still debate about whether that is true or not. But, of course, after the doctrine of discovery, it is now a race to conquer the land and conquer and enslave the people. And in 1501, Ferdinand allowed the first African slaves to be brought into Spanish colonies, but only if they had been converted to Christians. Of course, the Moors, the Muslims who he feared, and the Jews, or any newly converted Christians, were forbidden. And one of the first shipment of slaves to arrive in the quote-unquote New World was in 1502 by a merchant who had been authorized by the Spanish. And according to the records, his name was Juan de Cordoba. But it's important to know that as the slave trade continued to grow and expand, so did the rebellious nature of those who were being enslaved. And this is the part of history that is often left out. One of the earliest recorded rebellions in the quote-unquote New World, Hispaniola, was the revolt of Enrique. And I'm saying Enrique speaking English. Now, they pronounce his name Enriquillo, but as speaking English, we say Enrique. Now, he organized his people to fight back with whatever weapons they could have, whether it be a rock, a stick, or spears that they made themselves. And even though when they first arrived, they killed his father along with all of the other leaders by beheading them, Enrique still told his people to only fight back in self-defense. And if possible, just try to disarm them and not kill them. And to only attack those who are attacking you. And I'm going to be honest, that seems like a common theme throughout fighting colonialism. But, you know, they were still successful enough to force the Spanish to ask for a treaty. Now, their rebellion lasted from 1519 to 1533, according to the records. Now, I think this treaty is also important because it shows how they were going to handle eventual rebellions in the future. Now, they agreed to give Enrique and the others their freedom in exchange for helping them put down other rebellions. And this common theme throughout rebellion seems to be they try to just crush you with their military and their weapons. And if that doesn't work, they'll try to send in missionaries to talk you down. And if that doesn't work, they'll try to use someone that they captured to turn on you or to use them against you. And if that doesn't work, they'll just send in, those that they have already offered peace to come in and make sure that you stay enslaved. And that helped them to be able to keep people in a position of servitude. Because every time somebody rebelled, and if they couldn't handle it, they would just send their own people in to handle the situation. And Enrique agreed to this, and some argue because the damage had already been done. Their numbers had been reduced so much due to not only the war and murder and killing and slavery, but also the diseases that Europeans introduced to them. Because so many people died after meeting them. Now, some say Enrique and his people learned how to organize and fight the Spanish from Wolof African slaves who had been brought to the colony. And of course, Africans were supposed to replace the population that was dying off. But this is one of the first examples of African slaves working with native populations to fight colonialism and slavery. Eventually, Enrique kind of left, the Africans hanging, towards the end. But many people credit the Africans with showing them how to fight. And the Wolof African slaves, they had their own rebellion in 1521, which was called the Santo Domingo Slave Rebellion of 1521. Now, although there's limited information, especially the further back you go, but according to oral tradition, the rebellion was started by a Wolof couple, a sister named Maria Olaf and a brother named Gonzalo Mandinka. Now, again, I'm not exactly sure about their names. That's just according to the oral traditions, because I'm not sure if someone with a Mandinka last name would have been in the Wolof. But, that's just according to the oral story. But a group of slaves on Christmas Day, 1521, and the day is, kind of debated throughout history. Some people even say it happened in January 1522. But, let's just go with Christmas Day, 1521. A group of slaves organized to attack plantations. And the plantation they attacked happened to be owned by the governor, Diego Colon. I don't know if y'all recognize the name Diego Colon, but Christopher Columbus, his last name is actually Colon. and Diego Colon is actually Christopher Columbus's son. So according to the story, these slaves raid Diego Colon's plantation. So they took things that they needed like food, water, and other resources. They took weapons, and most importantly, they freed other slaves, many of which joined them. The rebellion did last for a while, but it was ultimately put down by a militia who was led by the governor Colon. But this is where we kind of see things start changing from religion to race. So Christopher Columbus' son, the governor, Diego Colon, introduced the first race-based laws into the quote-unquote New World. Both free and enslaved Africans, and Africans only, were restricted from moving around freely as they pleased, and their access to weapons were minimized if they were given any access at all. And unlike Spaniards who committed treason, who would be put on trial and maybe go to jail, if any African person led any rebellion, it was mandated that they be put to death. Anyone who was a leader or thought to be a leader was automatically put to death. And anyone else who they thought may be involved or thought about it was automatically tortured. He made it a mandate to torture them. Now, some say this rule only applied to Africans because the Taino population was dwindling. But these may have been the first laws based on race, more so than religion or any other ideology. So we see Diego Colon carrying on the legacy of his criminal father. But even though these laws were only against Africans, there were still several rebellions throughout the 1520s. And they were able to find some level of success by using their knowledge of the land and their knowledge of the Europeans against them. Now, even before the Spanish sent the first slaves to Hispaniola in 1511, they had already sent out more people to find more land and more resources. And by 1513, a Spanish sailor named Ponce de Leon landed in the area which we call Florida or the Carolinas, that whole region, Georgia, all of that region.
Ponce de Leon and the Fountain of Youth. The two are inseparable in the popular imagination. The image is one of a real-life Don Quixote on a romantic quest in the Florida wilderness for a magical stream that was the source of everlasting life.
So much in the New World was mysterious. You've got to remember that Ponce de Leon landed in Florida barely 20 years after Columbus had discovered the New World. So if we want to put it in a current context, he was closer in time to the discovery of the New World by Columbus than we are presently to the first landing on the moon.
Ponce was one of that tough and ruthless new breed of men who carved an empire for Spain from the previously uncharted lands of the New World. The Spanish called them conquistadors, conquerors, armored, sword-wielding mercenaries on horseback, seeking profit and adventure for its own sake, risking their lives for gold and glory.
Now, De Leon was not only out to look for gold. In his particular case, he said he was out to look for the Fountain of Youth, but he definitely found the opposite. Now, Ponce de Leon tried to claim the land for Spain, but when they saw indigenous tribes, they chased them back to their ships and forced them to flee. And likely they were on the outskirts trying to kidnap individuals to force them to give them information and to show them the land. And the indigenous people responded in a hostile way. Now, there were many people and many tribes in the area, but the only tribe that was identified was the Xhosa tribe. So when Ponce de Leon tried to return in 1521, they attacked them again, and this time they didn't miss. Ponce de Leon was hit with an arrow and they fled, but he eventually died of his wounds in Cuba. Now, even though we see all of these cases of resistance and will continue to see so many cases of resistance, the slave trade still escalated immensely after King Charles I of Spain granted their first transportation of enslaved people or kidnapping licenses in 1518. So basically, in 1518, King Charles I legalized human trafficking, or at least gave the licenses for human trafficking. And after that, thousands of people were sent to this quote-unquote New World each year after that. Number is really countless, but thousands of people were sent in each year after that. And by 1521, Hernan Cortez had destroyed the Aztec Empire, and the Inca Empire was gone by 1533. Now, when the Spanish returned to North America in the area near Georgia, South Carolina, in 1526, they brought over 100 slaves with them. Now, these were said to be the first African slaves that was actually brought into a colony in North America. And being known as the first African slaves brought into North America, guess what these brothers did? Now, these African slaves used division in the fight that was going on amongst the Spanish in their colony, because they had split into two sides and, they were fighting with each other. So these brothers used that as an opportunity to escape. When they had the opportunity, they burnt the house of a leader from one side. And when everybody was reacting to that, they went to the other side and freed the other slaves. Then they escaped the colony and went to go live with the native population. Now, I have seen some accounts of people saying, well, slaves was able to escape by blending in with the native population, but that's neither here nor there. But these first slaves that was brought into North America around the Georgia region fought, and they escaped, and they used their mind to escape slavery. But by 1542, over 30,000 enslaved Africans had been brought into Hispaniola. But the indigenous population had been so decimated, they actually outlawed Indian slavery in their territory. They also outlawed enslaving newly converted Christians. Now, this is something else we're going to have to pay attention to in future lessons, and how Christianity was used, especially in early times, and these false promises of converting to Christianity will save you, and the influence it may have on the black society to come. But after Portugal sent the first slaves directly from Africa to Brazil in 1550, it also led to a dramatic rise in slave rebellions between 1550 and 1552. There were several slave revolts in Peru, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and the Baiano Wars in Panama.
When Baiano arrived, it was an ideal place for him to find allies. In 1552, the ship that King Baiano was on became shipwrecked off the coast of Panama, and Baiano, along with many others, were able to escape on the shore. Baiano quickly became a leader and was a formidable opponent for the Spanish. Sources written by Spanish authors described Baiano as a very handsome and strong man who spoke Spanish well. His Spanish opponents assumed that Baiano had been a king or a leader in his homeland, and they called him El Rey Negro Baiano. His followers treated him with fear and respect, and they may have numbered more than 1,200 people. Baiano established a fortress for his rebel slave community in a thickly forested mountainous region on the Atlantic side of Panama. King Baiano fought the Spanish for 5 years in diverse ways.
Now, King Baiano and others freed themselves, and they helped free other African slaves. And every opportunity they had, they attacked Spanish markets. Now, King Baiano and his people were so successful, the Spanish was forced to negotiate and sign a treaty. And they were forced to do it on King Baiano's terms. Now, the Spanish offered them peace, and again, another tactic that we probably going to see repeated throughout a lot of these rebellions. When all of their attempts at stopping a rebellion is unsuccessful, once their military doesn't work, once the missionaries don't work, once they can't get any traders, or they can't bring in other freed Africans to help them, then they just use deception. When they told King Baiano and his people they wanted to meet him to sign a treaty for peace, King Baiano believed them and came to the meeting unarmed. They were captured and King Bayano was exiled. And I've even heard one story say that, they were tricked and poisoned. But according to most sources, he was exiled to Peru where he died. And most of his followers were either re-enslaved or killed or tortured. See this system of deception early on. We see a lot of the same tactics from the very beginning. Now, by 1560, Africans outnumbered Europeans 15-1 in Hispaniola. But the British didn't even get their first taste of the slave trade and slavery until 1562. And the first example of British participation on record is when an English sailor transported 300 slaves to the New World, or 300 enslaved people from Sierra Leone. But while the English was getting their first taste of the slave trade, the Spanish had already established their colony in North America. Now, remember, at this time, Europeans saw themselves as French, Spanish, Portuguese. They saw themselves as different tribes who were racing and competing to take lands of black, melanated people and enslave them. But many of their colonies in North America failed, especially, the British attempted 4 or 5 times, but, they were unable to survive the winters. A lot of times they resorted to cannibalism.
In 1585, 107 English settlers were dropped off on this coast with a mission to establish England's first permanent settlement in America. A replica of the kind of ship they arrived on is now docked close to where they made their historic landing. But after they arrived, the men clashed with Native Americans and started running out of supplies. They were forced to flee back to England just 1 year later. In 1587, an even larger group of 117 men, women, and children tried again to make a go at settling Roanoke Island. And that's when the mystery started. Three years later, when a supply ship arrived here, those on board made a chilling discovery. The Roanoke settlers had completely vanished. All that remained was an earthwork fort that still stands here in the trees, not far from the shore. They also discovered that someone had carved the word Croatoan into a wooden post, but they had no idea why.
So a lot of their colonies just was not successful. Now, the problem for the Spanish was creating a colony in North America also created an opportunity for slave revolts to happen in North America. And one of the first successful slave revolts was led by a brother named Gaspar Yanga in 1570. Gaspar Yanga is known as the first liberator of the Americas, and he led a revolt in Mexico. Gaspar Yanga helped establish the first black colony in North America, and they lived there for 40 years until they were attacked in 1609. But Gaspar Yanga and his people were prepared because we see a lot of success with these revolts, right? The people understood the land, and they also understood how these Europeans acted and their weaknesses. And we see a lot of success with these early revolts. And really, the most successful thing for the Europeans has been diseases and deception. Now, Gaspar Yanga and his people were so successful, and they pushed the Spanish back to the point where they had to sign a treaty in 1618. Now, we've already seen some broken treaties already. But with this treaty, Gaspar Yanga and his people helped establish the town of San Lorenzo de los Negros, which was officially recognized as the first black settlement in North America.
Gaspar Yanga led one of the most successful slave rebellions in the Americas. During the 16th century, sugar was the main crop in Veracruz. Yanga was among the many slaves brought over from West Africa and forced into working the Spanish sugar plantations in Mexico. Around 1570, he led a slave revolt and escaped with a group of followers into the mountainous terrain surrounding Veracruz. There, Yonga and his people formed a settlement which grew to some 550 people and eluded capture for nearly 30 years. This thriving community became a beacon of freedom for other runaway slaves. Yonga and his people survived through agriculture and livestock. They also waged a campaign against Spanish colonial rule, raiding caravans that ran between Veracruz and Mexico City carrying goods, food, and other supplies. Yonga's raids and the ongoing exodus of black and indigenous slaves to his community upset the Spanish plantation owners. The owners called on the colonial government to take action. In 1609, the Spanish governor sent a military force of 500 men to put an end to Yonga and his group. Opposing that force was Yonga's irregular army armed with firearms, machetes, bows and arrows, and even stones. When Yonga learned of the impending attack, he sent one of his Spanish prisoners to negotiate peace terms. The Spanish, however, had no interest in negotiation, and a brutal battle quickly ensued. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but the Spanish governor was forced to respect Yonga's strength. Yonga and his survivors retreated higher up into the mountains, out of Spanish reach, and again flourished. After many failed negotiations and military actions, the Spanish opted to negotiate in 1618. Under a treaty, Spain granted freedom to Yonga and his followers in exchange for an end to raids on Spanish caravans. In addition, the former slaves were given land, and Yonga and his family were recognized as the rulers of the community. By 1630, the town of San Lorenzo de los Negros was born, the first free African settlement in the Americas. In 1932, the town was renamed Yonga to honor the courageous man who represented hope and liberty to so many enslaved people.
Now, as we move into the 1600s, we're going to end this first lesson here. But we can already see the foundation and the seeds of the society and what eventually is to come being laid down already. And since this is just the first lesson, we just needed to establish the roots of what we're going to build upon in future lessons. Because we're starting to see how we're going from religion being the difference and being the main issue of the day to now the seeds of race being the major issue. Laws strictly against black people, against Africans, and especially those who were fighting for their freedom. But we also see that we've been fighting from day one, which is very important for us to understand. And we're starting to see the race to take land and resources and people and enslave the populations. We're starting to see that race start to develop amongst Europeans. So as we move into the 1600s and we see the slave trade starting to grow, on our next lesson, we'll start to see how African leaders responded to what's going on in the growing slave trade, especially leaders in areas that are the most affected. Even though we saw the doctrine of discovery, right? Because the doctrine of discovery was an important thing to help them steal the lands of somebody who doesn't believe that way. To them, a savage is anybody who doesn't bow down to European laws, deities, or culture. And they feel like they can murder, rape, steal, kill, enslave anybody who they label a savage. Meanwhile, most of it is just projection, and we see a lot of projection. So as we move forward, we'll see how black leaders, black kings, black people in general handle this newly growing slave trade. And also how these colonies in North America start to be established. And what role did black people play in colonial North America in the early times, and the colony of Virginia, and how these rules and laws shaped and continue to be shaped, and how we start to get away from religion to skin color and phenotype. So I appreciate everybody for coming to the first lesson. I'm going to see you next week for the second lesson. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. We're setting up a forum for anybody to ask any questions. So if you have any questions, let me know. And, we'll set up another forum for you to come on and ask questions live or just through the chat. So I'll see everybody next week for lesson 2 in Black Studies, African American Studies. And as always, we have got to start standing for something, or we're going to keep falling for anything.